Okay, so we've got a little bit of a fun video today. Not necessarily looking at guns design so much, but breaking more into weird semantics that surround firearms and a little bit of a delve into their history.
This AR-15 because no sear.
No, there's no searing Cole. So what we're going to dive in today is the wonderful world of AR-15 lore. This is a rabbit hole truly with no end. There's a lot of reasons that you can delve into, sometimes bordering on speculation as to why certain things are talked about the way they are when it comes to things AR-15. In this video, we're hoping to dive into some of the more egregious misconceptions that go on and give a fact-based, nuanced, measured approach that actually talks about real history and not post hoc justifications made up to justify the history that you didn't understand in the first place that you made up so that you could sound smart when talking about guns.
This mag's fake. This mag's fake because it's AR-15, that's the civilian one. And so the civilian AR-15, it says 223 Remington, but that says 5.56 millimeter.
And the milling meters are for the military.
That's a fake. You can't put the 5.56 in the AR-15.
So in order to break into a little bit of AR-15 lore, we're probably going to have to get some ground rule and some terms understood. These terms often escape people, and it's important that we sort of hammer them out now, because a lot of people's misconceptions come back to not understanding these terms. First term we're going to go over, select fire. Select fire means a firearm that has more than one firing mode. So that's not safe and semi.
Safe and semi.
Safe and semi isn't more than one firing mode.
I picked safe.
Safe and semi is one firing mode. Semi-automatic.
Oh.
If you have auto, it's a different firing mode. Burst, that's a different firing mode. If you have, for example, a binary trigger, I'd consider that a select fire system. But the select fire systems we'll be talking about in this video are either full auto or burst systems. Specifically, full auto in an AR-15 or the 3-round burst system that Colt did abortively. Colt also did 2-round burst systems, but that's sort of outside of the ambit of this particular video.
It was based on the finest military weapon of all time, the Breda PG.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's the world's greatest open bolt, toggle locked, gas operated 4-shot burst 7mm Mauser firearm.
Hands down. No competition.
Yeah. That was made in Italy for the Costa Rican military.
Second term that we're going to talk about is Armalite. Some people believe this is ArmorLite, and that ArmorLite was the material they made guns out of. This isn't true. I don't know where people come up with this.
That makes perfect sense.
It's Arma, A-R-M-A, like the video game, Light, L-I-T-E. This was a combination of, I believe, like Army and light, as in lightweight. Armalite was a California-based firearms manufacturer, really more of a firearms design firm, that was aimed at putting lightweight space age, their space age, which meant aluminum, materials in firearms, and then using that as something to market more towards the military. Armalite, for its history, was a military firearms design bureau. They designed military firearms first and foremost, focused a little bit less on the civilian sales of firearms. When they would sell civilian firearms, for the most part, with probably one exception being the AR-17, the shotgun. For the most part, when they sold a civilian firearm, it was based on a design that they made for the military first.
Right.
Delving further, and I guess also I should mention, when we talk about Armalite, I'm talking about that California-based company. Originally in Hollywood, they moved to Costa Mesa. Then they died in the 70s. Their name got sold off to the Philippines. It eventually came back. We don't care about the Philippines, and we don't care about it coming back to Geneseo, Illinois, where Mark Westrom did funny things with the soul puppet of Armalite.
That was so funny.
Not a knock on Mark Westrom, but it's a completely different company.
They make the new bolt action one. That's a big one, right?
Yeah, the Armalite 50. We're talking specifically about the California company that
it's like an AK-50 that exists.
Right. We're talking about the company that Eugene Stoner worked at.
Right.
The actual
a division
Armalite.
Of Fairchild.
Correct.
Right.
Fairchild Aircraft owned them. So semi-automatic. When we say semi-automatic, that refers to a gun which has a firing mechanism where one pull of the trigger gets you one round. The trigger must then be released or reset before you can pull the trigger and get another round to fire.
This was also known as self-loading.
Right. So the genesis of these terms, right? Automatic meant automatic loading. The gun loaded itself, to be contrasted with manually loading or repeating firearms, right? Repeating meaning it repeats without, it means it's got a magazine is sort of what repeating means for you.
Yeah, so you guys know, repeating firearms include bolt action, pump action, slide action, basically anything where you pull the trigger and then through some manipulation that doesn't involve you picking up a new round and shoving it in, firing another shot.
The gun tenders a new round into the action of the firearm because you did something to it.
And I really liked the old term self-loading because it was very transparent about what it was doing. Because with a repeating firearm, you are still manually loading it. But then the difference between that and a self-loading firearm, like I'll bring up a very early one here, is you pull the trigger and through a self-actuating mechanism related to the gun actually firing, it
loads itself.
Yeah, it does that thing that you would have done with your hand.
It ejects the fired cartridge, puts a new cartridge in the gun until it's out of ammunition and needs to be reloaded.
And so then the interesting thing here is that semi-automatic and fully automatic firearms are both self-loading.
Right, they're both automatic. So the term automatic at its genesis referred to automatic loading, self-loading. This term branched into two things whenever you then had guns that fired themselves as opposed to guns that needed you to pull the firing mechanism each time. Thus, semi-automatic, automatic loading, not automatic firing, and fully automatic, automatic loading, automatic firing, full auto.
Right.
Now, down this road of full auto, we eventually arrive at the term assault rifle. Much to people's chagrin, assault rifle is a real term. It's a term that was used. The U.S. military, in fact, promulgated a definition of assault rifle since the 1950s.
Right.
It's a term. It's been around. Even if you want to say that the translation from Sturmgewehr, the German term, isn't completely accurate to be assault rifle, that's fine. The U.S. military, the Army, in fact, has said that assault rifle is a term for some time. And it's not a useless term. It defines, rather aptly, a select fire, so more than one firing mode, 2 or even 3 in some cases, more than one firing mode, intermediate caliber, and we'll try and define intermediate caliber after this, but that's one of those very sticky subjects.
Right.
So select fire, intermediate caliber, generally lighter weight rifle that's intended to be used in a non-fixed position, right? It's intended to be used on the assault, or, and of course they can be used on the defense, right? But this is to be contrasted with things like automatic rifles,
right?
Because you had automatic rifles that sort of like something between a light machine gun and an infantry rifle.
Yeah, like the Shoshaw, like the BAR, where it was nominally an individual weapon, but in practice, two dudes were responsible for it.
Right, and so you run into things like the Fedorov, which was sort of in a caliber that you may be able to consider intermediate. Right. Was that the first assault rifle? No, because doctrinally that was an assault. It was an automatic rifle, not intended to be an assault rifle. It was intended to be like your BAR, like your Shoshaw.
Right.
So
whereas an assault rifle is something that it serves the same unitary purpose as a individual combat arm.
Right.
Like an M1 Garand, right? Though not in terms of its caliber or whatever, but in terms of the way it's used. A guy is responsible for it, and that's it.
Yep. Right. So again, we sort of touched on intermediate caliber. It generally means something between pistol caliber and rifle caliber.
And so, like, what does that mean, right?
That could be a lot of things.
It's very mushy.
Like, if you have a really hot 44 Magnum, is that an intermediate caliber? I don't know. It's better than a 45, and it's a lot less than a 30-06.
And then what's 30 carbine, right? But so let's just agree, which is the normal, the rational idea is that pistol is 9mm, rifle is 30-06/308.
Right.
And so it's spicier than this, not as pushy as that. It's in the middle.
Right. And
of course, there's a million things. There's, now in today's
there's so many knives you can stick in there. But how about heavy? He did that, but you think about this.
And there's so many wonderful intermediates between the intermediates. Like, I always like to point out that, you've got your full-size AKMs, then you've got the crank, and then in the middle, you've got the 105, 104, but then the Draco is that much-needed intermediate between the intermediate and the short, right? So you do wind up getting that, but it's fair to say that... Right, here's 9mm, here's 308,
somewhere
and then there's
in between there's a cartridges.
There's a curve of inclusion, right, where stuff that's dead in the center, like 545, 556, 762x39, it's beyond argument. You can't really, and so I guess if you wanted to put another pin in it, and the problems move on after that, a GPMG will not generally be in a intermediate caliber. General purpose machine.
So
vehicle mounted things.
Pushing on to hopefully our last few definitions here. Semantics. People often confuse semantic arguments with pedantic arguments.
Right.
There is some overlap between the two, but what I want the point to be here is that knowing about guns is fine and cool as long as you know about guns and you just don't make shit up about guns.
It is fun to do that.
Knowing about guns is almost purely semantics whenever you really get into knowing about guns. Beyond the this just black gun, right? Beyond the surface level stuff, knowing about guns involves a hilarious amount of semantics.
Right.
And that's sort of the, that semantic threshold is sort of if you compare a forgotten weapons video on a particular gun to a see an arsenal video on a particular gun. That's sort of where you'll see the difference between surface level knowledge and like, oh my God.
Yeah, my man read books.
Right. He read so many books, he can tell you for a fact that it's within these 3 years that this guy was born, and this was before birth records were kept. Right? So there's a lot of semantics that can go into these things, but these semantics are often important because it's the difference between getting something correct and something wildly wrong. Like, pants on head, you sound stupid when you say it wrong.
And why this is important, let me cut in here from a policy perspective, because I've worked in gun policy for most of my career, and I often see people making semantic firearms technical points to advance a policy position. And the most infuriating one, which I'm sure we'll get into, it has been, and people who were my colleagues would parrot this stupid AR15 is civilian sport gun, not M16. And I'd be like, hold on. You are arguing this, like, this isn't a dinner table discussion. You are arguing this in a policy arena. And dinner table discussions are just as important for policy, by the way, because they wind up being parroted. The points you are making, the technical points you are making,
are plain old wrong.
Well, not only are they wrong, but they have implications buried inside of them.
Yes.
So let's just take that quick example, which I'm sure we're going to go back more into. When you do the AR-15 M16 thing, and you say it's because the M16, which both of these were military pattern, and anyway, you're suggesting that the M16 is somehow different and is thus regulable, unlike your AR-15. And I don't know if you want to go down that road.
That's really not a strong policy position that because the military doesn't use this, we can have it. And in fact,
because I think the military doesn't use this, right?
And you in fact run into the logical conclusion of this, that and you see these gun rights groups decry it whenever judges like Frank Easterbrook say, okay, because this is like a gun the military uses, you can't have it. And they go, wait, no, please, no.
Yeah. Meanwhile, they've been parroting that for all this time. So we might sound like we're being pedantic, but it's actually important because, guys, if everyone wasn't getting away, if it wasn't part of the Fox News zeitgeist to say AR-15 and M16 not the same, Judge Easterbrook wouldn't be making those points, and we wouldn't be losing in that same way in those cases.
So we're probably losing in a different way, right? But force them...
But maybe a way that's more insane and less, right? Which is good. It's good to be... It's good for their argument to become less hinged.
It's good to force your opponents to sound insane.
Right.
Instead of letting them hang their hats on something that you dig them a trench to then put their arguments in and go, wait, no, I can't get to that. I can't attack that.
You're like, here's a tweet. You can use this against me later. And then you're like, then you act all shocked.
Oh, they use
shocked
it against
Pikachu.
me.
What do you mean? Right. But,
so I guess to give you an example of a semantic argument versus a pedantic argument. A pedantic argument would be like if somebody says, the M16 is the black rifle, and you go, no, that's gray.
Yeah, Colt couldn't figure out the black until...
Gray anodized, actually, M16s, they were all gray.
They were all gray because Colt couldn't figure it out. They may have tried, but it wasn't until the M4 that they actually figured out how to get it black.
Whereas a semantic argument is somebody pointing to a lower that's black anodized and has like the hybrid partial pocket cut, even though it's got the auto sear in it, it's got the hybrid cut, and they say that's an M16 lower, and you go, no, M16 lowers were gray, and they had fully cut out pockets.
Right.
So there's your technical difference versus your difference without a distinction. Like if you call this a black rifle, that's what the fucking gun's called. That's what people have called it since before most of us were born.
Right.
So sort of breaking into this more, we're going to get into what is known as taxonomy whenever you do it for species and biology, but gun taxonomy, I think it's still the right term to use, taxonomy, to sort of try and classify things into higher level categories and then lower level categories. So whenever we talk about taxonomy, we're talking about AR-15s. And of course, the AR-15, the rifles that Armalite made, that were all made like Armalite's rifles, is a specific.
Right.
It's more specific than AR-15s broadly. Whenever we look at this sort of family tree, we can put up a chart, but we've got AR-15s as the highest level order. Below them, we've got Semiauto AR-15s and select fire AR-15s. Every single AR-15 that Armalite ever made was a select fire AR-15.
Right.
Every,
the real Armalite.
Every V AR-15
right.
is a select fire AR-15. That said, we're breaking this down into a taxonomical structure because semi-automatic AR-15s are still AR-15s.
They're clearly lineal descendants of the Armalite select fire
Right.
AR-15.
And so it's important to make that distinction. We'll be making a lot of taxonomical references.
Mm-hmm.
So the statement, the M16 is an AR-15, is plainly true, assuming you understand AR-15's history. And we'll get a little bit more into that. This won't be an exhaustive AR-15 history like you may find elsewhere. However, if you do want an exhaustive AR-15 history, pick up the book, and there's PDFs of it online for free. It's The Black Rifle by Ed Azell.
Got a copy right over there.
It's an authoritative history, absolutely worth reading. But this won't be a full breakdown of the history, but if you do understand the history, the M16, M16 is the designation that was given by Department of Defense to the Colt AR-15 Model 604, which was derived from the 602, which was derived from the 601, which was derived from Armalite's AR-15.
Right.
Select fire the whole way down.
Yep.
At the time that the M16 designation was made, there wasn't a semi-automatic AR-15. It just didn't exist. It wasn't a thing. And thus, why the taxonomic and historical understanding is important. Because whenever you say, well, the military's never used and doesn't use and wouldn't use an AR-15, you're wrong.
Right.
You're just plain old wrong. And even if you say the military's never used a semi-automatic AR-15, you'd still be wrong, but we'll get into that little tidbit of Fudd bullet later. This pretty much gets us through our introduction. I just sort of want to reinforce the understanding the importance of the fact that when we talk about the AR-15, understanding the taxonomic structure is important. Understanding that, sure, there's 25 million plus semi-automatic AR-15s in consumer hands. That's great. Nothing about this should be taken as some sort of advocacy for gun control. That's sort of people's knee-jerk reactions. Whenever you start saying facts about the AR-15, they get uncomfortable and they're like, you want to ban them, don't you? And you're like, no, I'm just capable of reading a book and understanding things.
Well, and also just understanding the passage of time, right?
Right.
Because taxonomically, the AR-15 is the only gun where people make this intense category error and then fight it. Right. So, obviously, it's a family tree. And at the top of the family tree, you have the
AR-15 as broad as possible.
Right. And at the top of that is what everything relates back to, the Armalite pattern AR-15s. And so then it's a weapons pattern, right? There are parts that interchange between them.
Yep.
And that is the root. And then the M16 is somewhere deep down in that root. The M16 is not the beginning of the select fire branch.
Yes.
So it makes no sense to say that.
Right. The shorthand these days being like, if it's got a third pin, it's an M16 is like,
it's absurd.
It's sort of like egregiously wrong to suggest that's where that comes from.
Right.
It's like looking at an M4 and saying it's got an M16 lower.
Yeah.
Those are, I guess the funny thing is there are M4s out
some of them do.
that do have M16 lowers.
Right.
But the M4 has its own lower design and in fact changed some details in the technical drawings compared to the M16 lower.
And so I like to make the example though. People aggressively say, no, that's an M16 because it's third position. And then these same people will call any AK, if it eats 7.62 by 39,
an AK-47.
An AK-47.
The AK-47 proper, all select fire. They've never made a semi-automatic AK-47.
Yeah. So why aren't they acting weird about that, you know?
And I think it comes down to this thing where there's this feeling that like you as a gun owner want to know more about the guns than the people who want to ban them.
Right.
You know what the easiest way to know a lot about guns is? Just make it the fuck up. Just start making shit up.
Yeah.
The hardest way to understand more about guns is to learn about them.
Yeah.
And really, really the hardest hard mode is to admit you were wrong.
Right.
And so hopefully this video can maybe ease some people through that painful process of understanding you were wrong. Maybe it just sort of brushes you up on the AR-15's history and way to negotiate some arguments concerning it. Hopefully for some of you, it's just sort of fun because we'll get into some extremely comical AR-15
straight
lore.
bullshit,
Just some straight things that people actually make up.
Yeah. But,
so while right before we dive in, right, our last definition, AR-15. What is an AR-15? So dating back to the very beginning, right? Armalite, the firearms design company, they've designed the AR-10, and without going too much into that history, they designed a rifle that was maybe going to compete with the M14. It never had a serious shot against the M14. It was more or less like Armalite saying, like, look, here's our name.
Yeah.
Let us design guns for you. They'd already designed a gun for the Air Force that was not super successful.
Right.
So their name was already out there in military circles. They'd submitted other guns before the AR-10 for military testing. The AR-10 testing goes well, pretty well received. They have a gun blow up because the Army starts inventing new tests that wasn't actually publicized to the testing group, which is a little interesting. It forces the M14 to win, which is a whole story in and of itself.
Which we touch on in the M1A video.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's a whole story in and of itself. But that testing doesn't go great for them. Armalite sort of like, oh, shucks, we struck out this time. But the Air Force, well, the Army through CONARC, which is the Continental U.S. Army something, you can look that up. CONARC is what we'll refer to it as, its acronym. Approaches Armalite and says, we want you to make, they're interested in investigating a small caliber, high velocity prototype rifle. So taking a 22 caliber projectile, ramping it up to higher velocities, putting that in an infantry rifle, and then seeing how that performs from a standpoint of you've got lighter ammo.
Right.
It's the sort of things that people understand about the AR-15's design is it's the lighter ammo, more controllable and full auto.
It's made you got to wound them.
Lighter gun, all these sorts of things.
Shoot them to wound. Look, the little hole, and then it's going to take 3 guys.
And a very interesting part of that CONARC testing is they were dead set that the rifle had to be as lethal.
No.
They in their words, as lethal as 30-06 and 308.
No, because if you hit him with. If you wound him, then there's 2 guys that's got to pull him to the.
We'll get to plenty of that. In fact, that may actually be our first lore tidbit here that we'll get to.
Hit him. Look, it's so small.
The CONARC testing went extremely well.
Just a 22.
The Army was pretty pleased with the AR-15, but they go silent, right? They don't order any of them, and this puts Armalite in a weird spot because they paid a lot of money to develop the AR. Like it was a hilarious, like millions and millions of dollars they've dumped into this, and they're not getting any return on it.
Right.
And that makes their parent company not pleased with it. You've been pissing,
what are you doing?
You've been pissing away money and you've sold about nothing.
Right.
So Armalite sells the design of the AR-15, essentially its patents, to Colt. Contrary to popular belief, they don't sell the AR-15 trademark to Colt because Armalite never registered the AR-15 trademark, which is kind of bizarre.
Right.
Probably because, again, they wouldn't register it until it's a successful product because they
weren't selling them. They were
right. They need money. They don't need fuzzy little IP things to help them. So they sell the design to Colt. Colt initially wants to make AR-10s because that seems like that's the direction militaries want to go. Colt has some executives and Eugene Stoner tags along with him go out and tour the Asian countries to see if they want to buy AR-10s. They don't want to buy AR-10s, but they had a couple AR-15s with them. The Asian countries love the AR-15. They can't get enough of it. They're already entertaining orders like, when can we get this? When can we do this? One of the guys that's out there on that tour phones up the Colt factory, says, stop tooling up for AR-10s. You have to do this now. Make the AR-15. It's going to be a massive success.
Right.
Colt takes a leap of faith, believes him. This guy probably ended up saving... Colt extended the time that it would take for...
Until the next bankruptcy?
They extended Colt's next bankruptcy significantly.
Yeah.
And it was very fortuitous for everyone involved, really. But they go ahead and tool up for AR-15 manufacture. This begins the Colt model. At this time, Colt calls it the model AR-15 Model 01. Colt will later go and retcon that to be 601, where all the guns that have a 6 prefix have this sort of a rear sight going on. The 7s is the A2s, and the 9s is the flat tops. And I think the 8s was like the weird hybrid rail scope thing that they did. But anyway, that's sort of a little footnote there. So they start tooling up to make the 01. The Air Force then approaches Colt, and they're thrilled with this, right? Well, it's sort of an interesting way it happens. There's a guy who works at Colt, takes an 01 to the birthday party of General Curtis LeMay, or 4th of July party that he's at, which coincided with somebody's birthday. They go and shoot the gun. LeMay's enthralled with it. It's lightweight, blows up watermelons, good, super cool. This is a well-understood part of the AR-15 story. He wants to get that gun into Air Force hands because the Air Force has a bunch of M1 carbines that were supposed to be replaced by M2s or maybe M14s. The M14's not getting made. It's a dog. It sucks and it's expensive and they're not working. And M2s are being given to the people who aren't the Air Force base guards. But LeMay is adamant he wants to get 01s. It takes him a couple of years. In 1961, they get an order through. In 1962, that order is fulfilled. The Air Force adopts the AR-15 Model 01. No semi-automatic AR-15 exists at this point.
Right.
Only select fire AR-15s. Air Force
And the Air Force manuals, and we'll put them up here, they say...
Air Force AR-15.
Yeah.
They adopted the AR-15.
Yeah.
So Air Force now has their AR-15. Around this same time, there's the division of the precursor to DARPA, which is ARPA, is advising in Vietnam. We had special forces on the ground in Vietnam that were trying to kill communists, and we wanted to find out how to do that better. So we sent a bunch of O1s over there to have the Vietnamese troops used to shoot the North Vietnamese communist troops with the help of our advisors, our special forces. And so there's an interesting picture of one of these advisors, like who is there advising while holding a gun, doing a good advising while in combat.
Doing a big advice.
Here's how you do it.
Wow.
So he's doing a little bit of advising.
It blows up watermelons real good.
And so through all of this ARPA testing, the result was resounding success. They liked the gun. The South Vietnamese forces actually requested a semi-automatic only version of the gun because they felt that full auto just sort of wasted ammo, especially with the small statured soldiers. I haven't been able to find if anything ever actually came of this. Yeah. Because, of course they could have just removed auto steers and just had the guns be limited to semi anyway. But that was at least a request that was made at some point in time. Anyway, skipping forward, Colt, for military adoption, the Department of Defense realizes the M14 is lagging. It's pretty clear at this point that we're going to engineer the Gulf of Tonkin to happen. Right. And that we're going to be having a hot war in Vietnam. And so they realize the M14 is going to be lagging. They need new guns, and they need them now. The Department of Defense figures to tide us over until M14 production's in the swing of things, we're going to do a one-time buy of a bunch of AR-15s. They buy a mix of Colt 603s, and at this time, Colt has the 602, which is sort of a feature-improved 601, because both the Army and the Air Force were looking at it.
We'll put it up, but describe what the distinctions are between the 601 and 202.
Right. They wanted to change a bunch of things. They wanted to change the flash hider. They wanted to change charging handle. They wanted to essentially make a bunch of small changes to the gun to make it a little bit better. They wanted to get rid of the green furniture and make it black. Several changes they wanted rolled in. In fact, they had a lot of changes they wanted rolled in, but Colt only actually implemented a few of them because some of the changes they asked for was nonsense.
By the way, that's a 601 charging handle, which doesn't belong on here.
Yep, but it's cool.
But there's a funny reason why that's on there, which we might touch on.
And so, sort of skipping forward there, Colt was working on the 602, and the 602 and 604 were sort of the same thing. The Army, however, wanted a bolt closure device. They said they would not use a gun that didn't have this to force the bolt forward, whereas the Air Force was like, we don't want that stupid shit. Yeah. Doesn't matter to us anyway. We think that's silly. Yeah. And so Air Force was fine with the guns without them. So the 602 was the feature-improved 601. They then rolled that number to the 604 whenever they incorporated a few of the changes that were also going to go into the 603 that weren't the forward assist. So,
and real quick, my favorite part of the forward assist story is that there was a bunch of different versions, like some of which were on the left side, some of which were whatever. But then they had this weird fucked up one that was up here.
Right, because the original charging handles were up here. So they figured they'd just sort of like put a Douglas in here that you'd push down and then forward.
And Eugene Stoner liked that one the best because it would be easiest to remove when everyone realized how stupid it was.
Because he was like, we can just get rid of them whenever they start breaking, we can just take them off.
Yeah, he was like adamant. He's like, that's the one. Do that one. Solely because he was like, you can just take that shit right out. But we wound up not doing that, and you guys, what a good thing that we did, because then the Kyle did the Rittenhouse.
So the Department of Defense does a one-time buy of about 100,000. It was a mix of 604s, which is the slick slide, and 603s, which is the ones with the kicker. The thumb closure device is, I believe, the official term for it.
The kicker.
But at this time, the Department of Defense makes two designations. For the 604, M16, because it had been the 602 previously, which is why the numbers seem like they're out of order. The 603, the M16A1. The Army is adopting this provisionally, though. The Army's adoption is going to lag the DoD designation. The Army calls it the XM16E1 because it's still experimental, because they're still trying to figure out if we're actually going to completely get rid of the M14.
Right.
Spoiler alert, yeah, they do. So that sort of brings us up to the adoption phase of the gun. We then go through a lot of reliability questions with the gun, which probably is outside the scope of this video. Long story short, it has a lot less to do with the powder than you think, and a lot more to do with the fact that no cleaning kits, humid jungle. Colt was making these barrels out of some straight dog shit steel that was desperate to rust.
Right.
In a small caliber barrel with troops that weren't told to keep water out of the bores, nothing was chrome lined.
Right.
Nothing was chrome lined in these guns initially. This is just a recipe for rusty chambers. Get a rusty chamber.
It's just going to act wrong.
Right. You're going to have failures. Just how that goes. This paired with an unreliable buffer in the gun that would cause hammer follow or dead triggers. All manner of issues could be attributed to the buffer. In fact, bolts just not closing because when the buffer got wet, it decided it wanted to stay in the buffer. It liked its little home.
Yeah.
Lots of failures that was resolved by changing the buffer. The powder never actually, the powder changed to like the cheaper powder, which was really just the powder that could be got in quantity because the powder that Eugene Sunder specified was kind of oddball and hard to come by. It also couldn't meet the ballistics that they wanted. So they found a sort of wonder powder that was a little sootier that gave you the ballistics you wanted and could be found in quantities. And that powder, because it was sootier, didn't help with effect. The gun was like a rust trap waiting to happen with no cleaning kits with which to try and prevent the rust from happening. But that powder stayed in manufacture, and eventually they reduced the calcium content in the powder slightly to make it a little less sootier. But that powder is still used today. Derivative of the bad powder, still used today. The powder issues were mostly solved by having the heavier buffer, the buffer that actually does something useful.
Powder.
Yeah, the ball powder, stick powder thing,
Ball
right?
Stick powder.
Eugene Stoner and I chord hearings.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of that drama. We may touch on a little bit of that in breaking down the lore, but sort of outside the scope of this. The important thing to know is the reliability issues of this gun mostly stem from the fact that when Colt bought it, it was a relatively immature design.
Right.
From the time Colt bought it to the time there was hundreds of thousands of them in the military hands, like 2-3 years.
Right.
If you look at the M14, that dog had like 10 years before you reached that mark, and they already knew they were done with it. And they were like, "Fuck no, this isn't happening. this is a disaster."
Yeah.
So,
I would like to say real quick. So this would be a model of the M16A1.
Yep.
These are both, and this is always a fun game I like to ask because people always say, to touch again on the M16 AR15 thing. My favorite thing is this gun because every single part of this
is an M16A1.
Was legitimately M16A1. It was all kept together. The only thing that happened is when the parts kit came in, the lower was broken, right?
Yep.
So we make a new lower. Everything is exactly the same, right? Everything is cut the same way. We even did the
markings are the same.
Markings are the same. The fence, we did the weird fence bullshit. The only thing we did was not include an auto sear. So the gun started out marked exactly like this, M16A1. All of the same parts are all together. It is now still the same gun with one less piece. What do you call it?
And I think in a world where we get to call semi-automatic AR-15s AR-15, despite the AR-15 being a select fire rifle predominantly, the way it was designed, intended to be, I think that you end up calling this in semi-automatic M16.
I just call it an M16, and it just happens to be semi-auto, because I don't think it changes model when you leave one part out.
Right. And of course, it's an interchangeable part. If you had a third pin lower, switch it in there.
Yeah.
Every single part switches over.
And so then this is interesting, because this is, as it would have been the experimental Model 7, which this was before they had the 6 for that, so it just says Model 7. But what does it say right here? Colt AR15.
We'll probably overlay videos as we've been going.
Right.
Colt marked the first 2-3 million M16 family of rifles. All their full auto stuff marked AR-15.
Right.
They eventually dropped this name, and it's not immediately clear why. It may have been because by that time Vietnam was over, and the M16 had sort of gained a worldwide notoriety of actually being good. Contrary to what people in the U.S. thought, because the Vietnam War was unpopular, so the gun they used was going to be unpopular.
Right, bad gun.
Worldwide, the Australians loved their AR-15 M16s. The British loved their AR-15 M16s. The gun worldwide had a much better reception than it did internally, where it was like, it was a dog, it was unrleable. Meanwhile, the reliability issues were solved by 1968, which, for those of you Vietnam War experts, was like the beginning. Only got the fighting only got worse from there, and the M16 was a much more reliable, much more robust gun, past the point that they sort of ruggedized it for the environment it was going to be in.
And I do think it's interesting that while Colt was doing the experiments, like the Model 7, it's my favorite. Well, I might have a new favorite, which is something we're working on. But right now, this is my favorite AR. And the funny thing is, it is just as correct to have this with a forward assist as not a forward assist. Yeah. And that's like kind of one of the interesting things about these guns is that they were kind of just trying shit.
Colt did a lot of mixed masters.
Yeah, they were just like, see what's up. But yes, anyway.
The last comparison I will make to sort of hammer home the taxonomical concerns before we get into the AR15 more. We'll have to make a timestamp because this intro has been hilarious. The last comparison I will make, and we will reference this with a couple of the lore points, is think about Thompsons.
No.
No, please. So if you think about the Thompson as a family of firearms, like the Thompson submachine gun, of course, you initially
Thompson Center.
You initially have the Annihilator and these sorts of things, but sort of the first coalescent pattern of it is the 1921.
Right.
Select fire, fully automatic, capable, machine gun.
Fake locking system.
Fake locking system, even.
Yeah.
The 1927 Thompson is a 1921 Thompson, semi-automatic only. Fires from an open bolt still.
Yep.
But semi-auto only.
Yep.
The 1928 Thompson. Again, we changed some internal parts. Back to select fire, full auto capable. The M1 Thompson, M1A1 Thompson, also select fire. So the 27 is sort of the semi-automatic model. Is the 1927 Thompson a Thompson?
Yes.
Yes, it's in the fucking name.
Yeah.
Is the 28 Thompson a Thompson?
Yes.
Is the M1 submachine gun a Thompson?
Yes.
Yes. Even though it doesn't say Thompson in the name, they called it. They renamed it to the M1. It's a Thompson.
Right. Well, just
because they call it the M16 doesn't mean it's not also a member of the AR-15 family. The same way they call it an M1, the M1 submachine gun is a Thompson submachine gun.
But this is actually going in the correct order, this taxonomical concern, right? Because you can actually make the niggle that it's not the brand name, right?
Right.
Whereas in the AR-15 context, it's just completely fucking abandoned for no reason. And it's just based on some homism that you want to repeat.
Like in the Thompson context, people seem to get it. So whenever when NFA happens, people make NFA compliant versions of the Thompson.
Well, but here's the thing: is a West Hurley 1928
it was a semi-auto West Hurley or full auto one?
A full auto one.
Is it a Thompson? Yes, it's Thompson.
Okay, and here's the other thing: the M1 Garand. Only a couple hundred of those said Garand on it at all.
Right.
So the International Harvester US M1 rifle, is that a Garand?
Yes, it's a Garand.
Right? But it was made by the tractor company.
And so people understand this taxonomical concern really well most of the time. Like semi-auto Thompsons that Carr is making these days. It's a Thompson.
Right.
Works the same as a Thompson. In fact, it's strikingly similar inside, even though it's NFA compliant.
Right.
They're strikingly similar guns. So the taxonomical confusion with the AR-15 shouldn't exist. And so if you ever get confused, think about the Thompson. When they called it an M1, did it stop being a Thompson? No. You can expand this to other guns too, like the I guess it was rifle automatic M1918.
Right.
It's a BAR.
The Browning,
So that gun wasn't called in military circles. That's not the Browning automatic rifle.
Right.
It's the automatic rifle M1918. The rifle automatic M1918. Not the Browning automatic rifle. But it is a Browning automatic rifle. Just like the FN Model D is a Browning automatic rifle, just like the Colt Monitor is a Browning automatic rifle. Even though they've got brand-specific names, subsets of the Browning automatic rifle family. Again, taxonomical concern.
Right.
Hopefully, this is starting to make some sense to you guys.
And all this should be doing, like, if this is driving a point home and you're like, oh, I get it, and you simultaneously go, that's not AR-15.
You're not kidding.
Like, check yourself. You there's a reason we're still saying it. It's because you don't actually get it.
So hopefully we've driven that stake in enough for now.
And also, there is a good policy reason to be committed to this.
Right.
So.
And I think I can boil it down to something that's short enough. I'll include it now. The reason that it's important to maintain these things is because the legal zeitgeist in this country, right? Most judges aren't gun people, right?
Right.
Most gun lawyers aren't gun people, which is something
and
we can gripe about.
All judges are lawyers, so.
Right. That's the way it is, right?
Yep.
Their understanding of guns and what's normal in guns and gun culture and gun policy comes from what they see in movies and video games and read in TVs and hear on Fox News, mostly the Fox News part.
Mostly that.
That's sort of where their understanding of your rights comes from. if the conversation around your rights ends up surrounding these questions of, well, that one's for the military, you can have the one that's like, but it's not. It's completely different actually.
Yeah, it's completely different. Firing pin,
completely different from the military gun.
It's made of aluminum. That's the steel one.
That's actually that's really not good for you. And any hypothetical world where the Supreme Court adopts this sort of language, first off, that's a horrible reading of the Second Amendment, because it's not talking about the hunty sporty guns at all. But if the Supreme Court adopts a test where it's like, if it's less like a military gun, it's clearly protected, that's devastating. That's because the NFA is entirely valid now. Completely valid. It always will be. Right. You're fucked. You just stay fucked.
Yeah, because you got what you asked for.
The sort of arguments, the whole AR15, M16 deviation thing is the thing that you'd expect to see from like a Sotomayor or a Kagan, Supreme Court justice, where like
it was openly adopted by Jackson.
Right. It's like straight up making things up. Like nowhere in the Second Amendment or in the history of regulations is it like you can't have military arms. In fact, it's the other one.
Yeah, no, it's like, what are you doing with this bullshit? Where's the good shit?
And I think there is a much stronger constitutional argument to be made that you can have AR-15s, semi-auto AR-15s, because they're like M16s. I think it's much stronger. And eventually, maybe we find ourselves in a world where that's the case. But for now, we can just focus on being extremely autistic about gun history. So we're ready. We're ready to dive into our first tidbits of lore.
Wait, are we gonna cover what is not an AR-15 though?
Yeah. So this section is what an AR-15 isn't, and that's the lore.
Okay.
So like we touched on earlier, the genesis of most of this lore is somebody who's thinking the M16 and AR-15 are like super hybrid different firearms, and that the semi-automatic guns came first and the M16 was completely different. We'll dive into the nuance of those things, but usually people will invent stories to defend that misconception.
Right.
So first one of these, the AR-15 is designed to wound, which is also taken at the same time what the M16 was designed to wound. But then sometimes they flip it that the M16 is the deadly killer. It's a military weapon. It's very deadly. But the AR-15 so weak you can't even hunt.
No, you cannot even, because it's not even a good. It's not humane. It's just 22. It's not humane to do the deer like that.
So this is the one that I called the designed to section. So our first designed to wound. This one's answered pretty simple. The initial requirements set out for the caliber that became 223, which was originally called 222 Special. The original requirement set out for that was it had to kill people as good as 30 caliber, like the 30 caliber rifle cartridge.
And it was like helmet penetration at 500 or something?
Right, and it needed to penetrate a military helmet at 500 yards, which is, that kills people.
It's pretty killy, yeah. The people don't like it when you do that.
They did, depending on which report and which requirement set you're reading, they set that lethality threshold at 300 yards. At past 300 yards, they weren't checking lethality. They did go and shoot pigs to try and replicate wound damage and stuff, and their sort of conclusion was 223, when you get a good hit on a person, will kill them about as dead as, because it's sort of an overkill question, right? When you get a good hit with a 308, makes them very, very dead. Whenever you get a good hit with a 223, makes them dead. They're dead. The whole nonsense about it being designed to wound, I've talked with a lot of people who were involved in military instructional circles around the Vietnam time. The way they explained it is that you have an army of people who've been drafted, which means that they were too dumb to get out of the draft. Not a dig on the soldiers who were drafted and had to go and do something unpleasant because their country would have thrown them in a cell if they wouldn't.
Right.
But that's a fact. Their average IQ, the Army published, their average IQ was something like 70. Not good.
Hell yeah.
That's really not good.
That's our Midwest, baby.
So they're having to train a lot of us, our corn-fediest warriors, about how to go and fight with a weapon that feels like a toy.
Yeah.
How are you going to convince them to be effective with this and remind them? Right? It's a thing that soldiers forever have been taught. Right? You shoot the guy twice, even because he could be pretending to be dead or playing dead. All these sorts of things, as well as, especially when you're drafting people and you're not getting guys who are marksmen who want to just go murder.
Who want to go just kill people.
Usually in war, and you saw a lot of this in World War II, you have psychopaths who are like, I just want to kill people with squinty eyes. Can I do that? You had a little bit of that going on.
Welcome to the Marines.
You had a little bit of that going on in Vietnam, but maybe not as much, or at least people who were drafted there who weren't as willing to kill people. So whenever you're teaching people who aren't as good at shooting,
and who don't necessarily want to kill.
Right. Whenever you're teaching them, you may actually need to shoot that guy several times. Yeah. The easiest way to do it is tell them, your gun's weak. You might have to shoot him 2 or 3 times. Even if he's dropped to the ground, because this cartridge, it was designed to wound. He might not actually be dead yet. So if you think he's maybe still alive, give him a couple more.
Yeah.
And this was something that was observed in Korea with the whole 30 carbine doesn't kill because it can't go through a winter coat. It's because when you shoot around at somebody and you miss them, they hear that. and they're going to hit the ground. From your perspective, it was like, I got him. And then 30 seconds later, that guy gets up and he's like, shit, I hope I don't get shot at again.
Yeah, that sucked.
So it's sort of a training thing. And I had it explained to me pretty cohesively by a guy who was involved in the sort of Vietnam era military training, that we were training a bunch of people who weren't very literate, who weren't very good at what they were doing, weren't good at shooting, weren't ready for the awful things they were about to be subjected to. Easiest way to get them hammered home some fundamentals is tell them that their gun is designed to wound, and that's on purpose. That way they won't feel incompetent with their light caliber, with their light gun. If they shoot at a guy and they hit the ground, you can automatically have them be like, he's not dead, he's faking it. Yeah. Oh, he's just wounded.
Right.
I'll shoot him some more. And then maybe you'll actually hit him this time.
Right.
So it was a training thing. This then branches out where there was guys I was talking to who went to boot camp within the past 4 years and were told this same story. It's just not true. There has been extensive research into the lethality of 223. Essentially every time that there's a question about it maybe being lethal or not, Army goes and reinvestigates it, and surprise, surprise, finds out 223 kills people pretty darn bad. There's only lagging questions of lethality whenever you're maybe facing combatants who are using drugs and you're only shooting them in extremities.
Right.
In which case, maybe shoot them somewhere besides their extremities, if that is so convenient to you. Or, again, usually it comes back to a training issue. So designed to wound, stop saying it. It's just stupid.
Yeah, and I'll admit, I have said that because it was so pervasive, and you'd hear it from people who you trust.
Right. It takes 3 guys out of combat. Well, when the guy gets shot in combat, you don't call a timeout and go and drag it. Being shot at.
It's not real.
You don't get a timeout. Yeah. It's not like a Nerf war where you can't shoot at the medics. Yeah. Back in the war, you shoot at the guys with the cross on their helmets. Because why not?
Yeah, even if they say not to, they do it.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess as a part of this design to wound, there's this question of it can't kill a deer. 223 is entirely capable of killing deer.
If the states are stupid and if you want to base your understanding of gun policy on hunting laws, that's the stupidest possible way to do it, because we have tolerated the most retarded restrictions and regulations.
Right, because the people writing gun restrictions are, in certain states, it's people who have never seen a deer because they live in a city. But then in other cases, they're like the turbo fuddiest of turbo fuds. They're like dirty, reverect, no, Winchester 94, no, they ever need.
No, you need a real rifle caliber like the 30-30, which, what do you mean is ballistically identical to 7.62 by 39? It's a rifle caliber. That's a submachine gun.
So that sort of covers that tidbit of war. Next one up. Designed as a semi-automatic. This one's easy. It wasn't.
It's bullshit.
It wasn't.
Yeah, there's no evidence whatsoever.
The first semi-automatic design that you can point to actually having been put together is in 1963.
The Comanche?
Right, and then that was Colt put together a semi-automatic variant of the M16 proper, changed a bunch of stuff on it because in a pre-Gun Control Act world, this wasn't the firearm.
Right.
This was the firearm. Every piece of it, when you broke it down, it was all still a gun part, which was supposed to be regulated and shipped as a firearm. Yeah. Because there wasn't FFLs, this wasn't an overly burdensome system.
Right.
The Gun Control Act in 1968 changed that around. But in 1963, Colt sent a semi-automatic variant of the M16 to ATF, which at that point was called ATTD.
Right.
Asked if it was okay. They got the answer back, yes. Colt changed probably more in the gun for compliance than they needed to. They were changing the size of the takedown pinholes, all sorts of stuff, changing and making different cuts on bolt carriers, as I'm sure you're familiar with. But the gun was still based on the AR15. Specifically, Colt's AR15 Model 604, which was the M16, was the sort of genesis point of their sporter.
Right.
Initially, Colt called this the Colt Comanche. However, there was a company making a 22 bolt action at the time that was called the Comanche. This company said, hey, Colt, would you not? And Colt, interestingly, relented and picked a lame name like Sporter instead. That's sort of the direction Colt went with that. But all the way back to ArmalLite, it was a select fire rifle. The ArmalLite did consider at one point a semi-automatic AR-10, but dumped this once the AR-15. Once Conark approached them and said, "Would you make us this small caliber rifle?" They were like, "We're not making a semi-auto AR-10." Yeah. And frankly, had they had, it would have bombed massively because this, whenever Colt introduces a semi-auto AR-15, massive sales failure.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to buy that thing. Yeah. It picks up a little steam after Vietnam, but not much. It really doesn't pick up sales steam until the 90s, whenever there's massive attempts to ban them.
Right. And people are like, "You want to ban? I don't want to take that."
And that made them very popular. And most of that is because the whole time Colt was making them, they were pretty darn expensive.
Right.
And we found articles from the time.
Space age aluminum.
We found articles from the time of people reviewing the Colt Comanche, the Sporter, everyone that was a gun reviewer at the time only had bad things to say about it because it's a military gun.
Right.
And the public perception of owning military guns in civilian circles wasn't positive.
Right.
Just the way it was. So the gun wasn't popular because of it. You know, gun reviewers who are otherwise Second Amendment guys are like, this is literally a fucking assault rifle. I don't want this shit. There's no sporting use for this.
Where's the checkering?
It's got a pistol grip.
Where's the checkering?
The what? And in fact, they complained about the magazine being pinned to 5 rounds. They didn't like that you could unpin it to 20 rounds. They were like, who the fuck needs 20 rounds for hunting? And so, you know, it's a lot of...
They were on, like, they had a different type of brainworm back then.
Fudd shit today was just normal then.
Yeah.
Which is... You know, an example of how far the Overton windows shifted. And that's
well, and I do always like to point out, at that time, like 60-something% of people, according to I forgot what polls are at the time, 60-something% of people wanted a absolute ban on the sale of handguns.
Yep.
Like there's no more handguns. Who would only a Negro would own a handgun? Right. That was literally
crime addicts and all these.
Yeah, because you have to be dishonest to be concealing a firearm.
So
and then now what is it? Now white people are carrying handguns everywhere.
Our next tidbit here is that the AR-15 was redesigned by Colt to become the M16. Colt did change a lot of things from Armalite's designs. Armalite's fire control group, in fact, was completely redesigned once Colt got the gun. A lot of things did change. It was always select fire, though. And in fact, the way the autoseer worked, even in Armalite's original fire control group, never changed. That was the one part of the gun that stayed the same from the very beginning, was how the autoseer...
It did have a very fucked up hammer.
Yeah, it had a fucked up hammer and a fucked up way that the trigger had a double sear on it that was both the disconnecting and the primary sear. It was a fascinating fire control group design that Mr. Stoner, I believe, came up with. This
came to have been a dream.
And came to like a drug-induced state, perhaps. So it was a little interesting. Colt did make a lot of design changes. Colt did make design changes that ended up becoming rolled up into the M16, but they didn't redesign. Like, it's not like the AR-15 was something else.
No, they made it manufacturable and not insane in some ways.
And you know, they made the AR-15 model 604, and that got adopted as the M16.
Yeah.
There wasn't. Whenever people say redesign, I believe what they're saying is Colt had a semi-automatic rifle that they changed into a select fire rifle. Simply not how that worked.
Yeah.
At all. In fact, military pedigree was being refined every, Armalite, 01, 02, 03, 04, military pedigree is being refined.
And then the first semi-automatic one is not an 01.
Right.
It's an 04.
It's like a weird variant, like a 02 parts in it.
Right.
With an 04, right.
But it wasn't like, it was an 04 pattern, and it was probably that they had made too much 02
shit.
They had
02 parts that they sort of like crammed in, like
that is interesting on the Colt Sporters. You see unreinforced lowers for like a long ass time, like including to when you get the 7 series, the A2 rear sight, you're still seeing completely unenforced lowers, and I think that what that tells me is they were just using shit that they had.
And interestingly, of the Sporters, as the improvements get made, chrome carriers, improved buffers, chrome in the barrels, chrome lining for corrosion resistance, changes to materials, changes to receiver material even. The Sporters get that. Yeah. Colt rolls in the military-derived, needs to be a good effective combat rifle and Vietnam features into the civilian gun. Mostly so they don't have, like, 2 production lines.
I have
2 runs of parts.
I have a Sporter. I have a 700 series Sporter. What do you think they meant by this?
Government model. Of course, they've been doing that with their 1911s as well, but guess what the pedigree for the 1911 is? Killing Filipinos, so.
Right. And so, this is interesting. We've got the no reinforced lower.
No humps.
The weird, different sized takedown holes. But if we pull her open,
we have some weird neutered bolt carrier.
Bizarrely neutered, but chrome on the inside, chrome
in the
chamber.
The
yeah. It's got a lot of the
military features that on a civilian rifle, frankly, wasn't necessary. And much as I hate to agree with those Fudds, it's like, these are military features on a civilian rifle, which is great. I think they think it was lame. I think it's fantastic, but that's sort of hopefully indicative of, again, reinforcing this taxonomical understanding. The semi-automatic versions were derivatives of the select fire ones. In fact, that's an M16A2 rear sight. Boy, they sure didn't design that for sporting. And in fact, I believe the original design of that traces back to Colt's attempt to make LMGs off of the M16 platform. But anyway, that's sort of another interesting cornerstone there.
Yep. This is another... No feds.
Yep.
And this is like almost... I'm not sure if this is ban era or not, but we had abandoned that like in the 60s, and yet they're still like...
and the spoilers.
We got extra ones. We can leave that thing.
Yep.
Anyway.
So next point of lore to touch on. This is one I've heard from multiple people. I don't know if there's like a PSA that went out that I missed, but it's
Palmetto State.
The M16 was designed to be inaccurate. The AR15 is designed to be accurate. I don't know. My fucking.
It just gave me a stroke.
I've heard this from multiple people. To be sure, the M16's accuracy requirements in Vietnam, like by modern standards, isn't great. It was like 4 inches or whatever. But whenever you look at 3 or 4 inches at the time, 3 inches was like the national match standard for like really.
So it was 4 inches. So then, so that must be like way looser than it was for the like M1 Garand, right?
And I mean,
no, it's not.
These days there are plenty of civilian semi-ARs that can shoot minute of angle. Mm-hmm. That said, there's also a bunch of military ARs that can shoot minute of angle. They call them designated marksman rifles, and we'll get all sorts of into those nerdy guns later. But the question of one designed to be more accurate, the other is, again, a fundamental understanding of the taxonomy going on here. The M16 is an AR-15. It's not one or the other.
Yes.
Next up, there's people who believe 100% designed as a hunting sporting rifle.
That's retarded.
To be sure, Colt marketed the first semi-automatic rifle as a hunting sporting rifle. Even the first gun reviewers to touch it saw straight through that.
Yeah.
And these guys aren't anti-gunners, right? These guys are pro-gun journalists who make a job, a living out of writing about new guns that come out, reviewing and testing them. And they're like, dog, what the fuck is this shit?
Like, you're gonna act all strange.
It was pretty close to like nothing else on the market. Something looking very similar to this, but without the forward assist is what they were buying. It was certainly not designed. The AR-15, as the family of weapons, was not designed for that. It was designed as a military rifle and groomed for that for about 8 years.
Grooming. Until
they got to the point that they were like, okay, here's a semi-automatic variant. What specific design changes were made to make it for hunting and sporting? They took select fire out and that's it.
Yeah,
they disabled select fire capability. They made it NFA compliant. Does NFA compliant mean that it's a hunty sporty rifle? Because I think that's a really retarded way to look at it.
No, it is. And that way you could import it too. Is it like the Sporter, the Norenko Sports, and the Sport Foul, and the Sport K31 and the Sport Luger, and like
the Sport Luger.
That is something that like really infuriates me. Is that like around when like at the time of the Federal Firearms Act and when we were gearing up for the Gun Control Act, there was this like military guns are dirty, and it came. A lot of it was rooted in like a couple of assassination attempts that happened with military surplus guns. And so then the public consensus, and again, because the average person was retarded, was that you would only use a military gun if you're trying to like do dirty stuff and kill people. In actuality, there's a much better explanation for why people were using military guns.
They're really cheap.
Yeah, it was because you'd go to a gun store, you'd be like, I need something that can shoot like 100 yards. We got a Winchester 70. It's the equivalent of 4 weeks' pay. How much for the Italian one? A day's pay.
5 minutes pay.
Give me the Italian. Right? Like, what the fuck? It's just, like, there's a lot of data that I've crunched in gun control circles, such as, there's a self-harm is a common point of concern, and it's one that is actually laudable because it's one of the only areas that you could actually make some motion on the margin, but people start to wonder about, what guns are people choosing do self-harm with, and the suggestion is that we then regulate these guns.
It's whatever's cheapest.
People, yeah, they're like, oh, it's revolver. Well, it's Taurus revolvers. It's the one that is like literally. You look at the data and you can imagine the discussion where it's like, what do you want for a handgun? It's cheapest. Which one do you have? And, so, yeah, it's the same thing. But I guess all that to say, it then annoys me that it reverberated and pulsated to the point where, because Colt reflexively in a market that was scared of Carcanos, use the term sporter to go, no, it's not that. Now, like, the pulses from that are, he was clearly the huntsman.
Yeah, it's clearly a huntsman.
Modern sportsman. You easily get the deer out of that buckhorn.
Yeah, it's completely different than an M16, and you can tell that because
modern sportsman.
Because it's limited to the mode that the soldiers use to kill people only.
Yes, limited to the mode that they use the most often to kill people.
And that's because it's for sport hunting.
Sporting. It's not a Carcano.
Yeah. And so it's just kind of stupid.
Yeah.
Yep. And that really dovetails nicely into our next one, which is it's designed. It's not designed to be a weapon of war, right? The AR-15 totally did the first because
it's aluminum.
The first sales of an AR-15 is to military. The second sales of an AR-15 military. Third, fourth, fifth, and I think all the way through the eighth, right? Through the eighth, like big order of AR-15s, it's all military customers that are going to be using.
Right, but those ones are steals.
We'll get to that excellent one later.
Then they had the titanium gyring. And they just look 223.
Yeah,
And the 5.56. That's my favorite one.
We've got that one coming up.
Okay. That's
so
my favorite.
the weapon of war one it's kind of stupid, and the definition ends up being needlessly circular, where it's like the definition of weapon of war is it's a weapon that gets used in war. And so I'll ask them to define a sporter, like what makes a sporter different, and they're like, well, I use it in sport. And so I'm like, okay, cool. So if I use a semi-automatic AR-15 in war, semi-auto AR-15s are weapons of war, right? And they'll go, And I'm like, okay, fine. If I use an M16A4 to shoot targets with or hunt a deer with, that means that it's a hunting sporting rifle, right? And they're like, their brain short circuits, right?
No.
They realize they're just relying on a circular definition for things. If you use objective design criteria to decide what is and isn't a weapon of war, features that make it sort of faster handling and faster target acquisition and target sites that are useful for shooting at people, these sorts of things are more weapon of war.
Yeah.
They didn't change the sights on the SP1.
Right.
It's a human shooting sight that they left on this gun.
I wouldn't worry about it.
Whereas whenever you get into more traditional things, like it's got maybe a stock that lets it float is a common thing that you see with more sporty style guns. It's not necessarily needing to be extremely reliable. It's not necessarily something that has to go a large number of rounds without being cleaned. It doesn't have these more military considerations baked into them. Recoil control typically doesn't matter. You're not needing to, your life doesn't depend on that follow-up shot.
Disassembly
can be like 15,000 screws in there. They can be like, Browning would design it. Browning is the guy that people think Eugene Stoner is.
Right.
Like Browning designed a lot of very civilian-oriented firearms, and he's like, if it takes you 3 hours to take the gun apart, it's not my fucking problem.
Yeah, it's just as long as I can train my guys.
And Stoner's like, it's 2 pins in the tip of a bullet. Because I want idiot jarheads like myself to be able to take this gun apart so they can shoot more communists. So, not a weapon of war. It's silly. Don't get hung up on idiot circular arguments, right?
Right.
Our next category, we're out of the design 2, and we're on to the terrible technical trouble category.
Terrible technical trouble.
The AR-15 has less range than the M16.
Yeah, it's because the bore is.
This comes from an AI-generated article. I believe I've seen multiple people point to an AI-generated article that says that the standard quoted effective range of an AR-15 is like 500 yards. The standard effective range of an M16 is 700 yards.
Oh.
Therefore, the M16. Of course, this comes down to the configuration of the gun. You can have an AR-15 with a 20-inch barrel. You can have an AR-15 with an M16 barrel. You can have an AR-15 with an M16 barrel that isn't just an M16. There's many different ways that you can sort of rebut this one. I think the easiest one is The barrel is a modular component for both guns. It swaps back and forth between them.
You change it. You're allowed to change
it. You can get the same range and accuracy out of either one. 223 and 5.56 means they are different weapons.
Yeah.
This is a fundamental misunderstanding, and we're not going to delve all the way into the cartridge's history.
You know what I do? I keep a mag of 5.56 just in case.
To brush you guys up on this one most coherently,
yeah.
The United States was a member of NATO at the time this was happening. NATO was doing cartridges in millimeters. The United States adopted 223 Remington as cartridge ball 5.56 millimeter. Yeah. 5.56 in the time of Vietnam was 223 Remington. They did have the question of changing powders over, and that technically actually brought the pressures down and brought the velocities up, which is kind of fucking funny. That was 223. As a part of this, by the time they get 223 semi-standardized, they weren't counting on putting tracers and heavier projectiles in it. Once they did that, they saw that there was also going to be pressure concerns in order to keep pressure signs down in the guns, plus the fact that they were using the ammo that was more pressure, less velocity, and then trying to put more powder in it to get even more pressure to get it up to the velocity they needed. They ended up adding a little bit longer throat to see if that would help. That did help with the pressure signs. However, they ended up solving the pressure signs with the powder that then brought everything back more into whack. Yeah. And the extra long throat just ends up sort of becoming a safety factor. However, then this becomes two different chambers on the guns. All of the, so far as I'm aware, every SP1, and I believe all of the M16s, so M16, XM16s, all these sorts of things, had the longer throat in them. I believe past the time they move past the 1 in 14 barrels in the sort of super prototype ARs, and then into the 1 in 12, out of the Model 01, they had figured out the chamber needing to be a little bit longer. So, or the throat really is just a little bit longer. Chamber itself is not only the same. So they lengthened the throat just a little bit to help with pressure signs in some cases. There are some guns around this time that are chambered to a nominal 223 SAMI chamber, which if you use one of these extra pressure 223s or use it with a tracer, may show pressure signs. You're going to be running a little bit over pressure, but it's not like proof load over
You will
pressure.
Get slight vertical stringing.
Right. You're not going to be in massive trouble as a result of this.
And the only time that you're going to run into this issue would be
really
if you
old stuff.
Well, if you had like some really old stuff and you're shooting the really old stuff with stuff that its barrel wouldn't stabilize anyway.
Right.
Or you've got like a bench rest rifle that whose barrel was chambered on, like was cut on a lathe.
You yourself made sure had a chamber that was so tight that 55 grain just kisses the lead.
Yeah. So, but all that to say, it is not a realistic difference. Right. It is a nominal distinction on a chamber drawing, which then only shows up on the chamber reamer. And if you're then cutting chambers, which one are you going to fucking use?
The one that's more permissive. And then 223 Wild is like the super solution, and it's 223 Wild is just like it splits the difference.
So it's actually worse.
Whatever.
Yeah.
And so the notion that 223 and 5.56 means they're different is wrong. People will then say like, oh, but the M16 was in 5.56 NATO. 5.56 NATO did not exist when the M16 was a thing.
Yeah, we were the only ones using it.
Right. 5.56 NATO ended up being adopted well after Vietnam, and then we adopted the M16A2 because the M16 and M16A1 won't stabilize 5.56 NATO because 5.56 NATO is very specifically a 62 grain projectile. Right. It's your green tip is 5.56 NATO. So all that to say, drop the confusion about 223 and 5.56. Just because the M16 and M16A1 said 5.56 on them doesn't mean it was 5.56 NATO, because it was actually 223 Remington, the only 223 Remington that existed at this time.
And also, at the end of the day, no matter what your gun says, it's going to eat 55 grain.
Right.
And it's going to handle it just fine. If you have heavier stuff, if it is newer than this, it is going to eat it and handle it just fine.
Should be
If
fine.
It looks like this, it's probably fine.
Right.
Looks like this or any of the newer stuff.
Finally, there's this insane, finally in this terrible technical trouble category, there's this funny idea that you can't buy a select fire AR-15 at pick a store. Walmart, Cabela's, Bass Pro, your local FFL, mom and pop gun store, Amazon, you name it, somebody's complained about, well, okay, if the M16 if the M16 is an AR-15, why can't I buy one at Cabela's? Well, the NFA, dumb fuck. That's the reason that you can't buy it.
It's because I go to Walmart and buy Thompson.
It's the same reason you can't go to Walmart and buy a suppressor.
Yeah.
They're not interested in selling NFA firearms. Does that mean that suppressors don't exist? No. Does that mean that suppressors aren't sound moderators? No! Right. And just because Walmart won't sell you a Select Fire AR-15, A, doesn't mean that Select Fire AR-15s don't exist. And B, just because they won't sell you an M16 doesn't mean that M16s aren't AR-15s, even though Walmart at one point in time would sell you a semi-automatic AR-15, which they won't any longer. Which then begs the question, Walmart won't sell you a semi-automatic AR-15. They will sell you one in .22 long rifle, or potentially they'd sell you a bolt action one, right? Does this mean that the AR-15 is actually a bolt action because Walmart only sells bolt action AR-15s?
Yes.
Some people would somehow, for some reason, say yes. True. If they were trying to be consistent.
Walmart has Henry Golden Boy.
Our next category here, hilarious history hijinks. Ooh. Our first one, and this is a wildly notorious one. The AR-15...
Wait, when do we do what's not an AR-15?
This is all sort of part of what's not.
Okay.
To show us the difference.
Okay.
So...
We want to show off the cool shit.
Right. So the first one here is that the AR-15 failed against the M14, and that's when they made it semi-automatic.
Because it didn't hit hard.
It's simply not true. The AR-15, interestingly, never really went head-to-head with the M14. There was testing that happened with the Army, where an M14 was tested for failure rate, and an AR-15 was also tested for failure rate, but it wasn't like a head-to-head competition because the M14 had already been adopted.
Right.
It was just sort of like a cross-evaluation. It wasn't head-to-head. And the results of that testing was that the AR-15 did better, which is kind of hilarious. So no, it didn't fail. At every step along the AR-15's progression, it was only ever like thumbs up, A+, way to go. We like this. We should adopt this. This is great. And it was kind of prescient because it did end up benefiting the United States military pretty substantially, and it was much better than the dog that was the M14. So that didn't fail. That's not what happened. At the point it got made semi-automatic, Colt had just sold 100,000 of them. Colt sells 100,000 of them to the Department of Defense. It's a lot. It's the biggest order they've got so far. It's a lot of fucking guns, right? Mm-hmm. That's close to paying off the money they've invested into this already. Colt's like, fuck yeah. Then they go and delve into a semi-automatic version because Colt wasn't sure that 100,000 was coming. They'd sold like a couple of thousand up to this point. I guess 10,000 to the tens of thousands to the Air Force. Sold a couple 10,000 to a couple foreign militaries. Then they're not sure if this big order is ever going to come from Department of Defense. So they're like, we're going to start working on semi-automatic. Oh, great big order from Department of Defense. Like, also, we got a semi-automatic version coming. And then semi-automatic version comes the year after.
And nobody bought it.
And nobody bought it. So no, that's its failure against the M14 is not why it was made semi-automatic. It's because Colt was like, I don't know, I guess, fuck it, we'll try.
Yeah.
And it wasn't very successful.
See if maybe somebody buys it.
Okie dokie. Then next up, you hear that story backwards. Which was, it was a semi-automatic. It was tested against the M14. It failed because it was semi-automatic, and that's why they had to make it select fire. Yeah. That semi-automatic AR-15 was not evaluated, tested, considered, asked for, requested, required by any part of its testing along the way. Although...
Except for those Asians who wanted it.
Right.
Who Colt ignored.
Right. As far as I can tell, Colt was like, cool, don't care. That you do eventually run into military, even U.S. military use of semi-automatic AR-15s, and we will get to that in a future section, but this one's funny. You can tell whenever a Fudd lore is told two directions that is probably wrong both ways, and this is a good example of that. Next one. The AR stands for XYZ. Pick a thing the AR stands for. The only way that you can be wrong about this...
Almost rifle.
The only way that you can be correct, I should say, about this is by not being certain what it stands for.
Yeah.
Eugene Stoner's daughter says that Eugene Stoner himself always said it was ArmalLite research. Jim Sullivan, who worked there along Eugene Stoner, said that was ArmalLite rifle even though they made shotguns.
Right.
And then some people will point to the AR-24 pistol. The AR-24 pistol is a Turkish knockoff of a CZ-75, a company in Illinois that owns the right to the ArmalLite name imports.
Right.
It's not an ArmalLite product.
Right.
So, the ArmalLite rifle maybe it's ArmalLite research. Well, Colt says something different for a while. After Colt buys the design for ArmalLite, ArmalLite's kind of a sinking ship, and they're also a direct competitor. ArmalLite's trying to get the AR-15, when the AR-15's having its teething issues, ArmalLite's trying to say, we got the 18, we got the AR-18, buy the AR-18, buy the AR-18, the U.S. military, buy the AR-18, buy the AR-18. Please, everyone, buy this. We're going under.
Help.
Eugene Stoner left to go work at the Cadillac Gauge Company. We need help.
Right.
And so, they're desperate at this point, and they're sort of competitors. So Colt doesn't necessarily want Armalite's name on their gun.
Yeah.
People will point to there being a contractual obligation for Armalite to use,
That's
for Colt to use
insane.
Armalite.
Yeah.
That's not.
Yeah, that would have never made any sense.
Not how that works.
Yeah.
Colt owned the patents outright. Armalite never owned any of the trademarks for the guns. Colt registers those trademarks almost straight away because Colt's got customers, right? That Armalite never had. So Colt wants to sort of distinguish themselves from Armalite at this point. So Colt comes up with this great idea. Nobody really knows what the AR stands for. It's going to be Colt AR15. Colt says it's the Colt Automatic Rifle 15 family of firearms. And they include in this the Colt Automatic Rifle Heavy Assault Rifle. That's the LMG. They include the Colt Automatic Rifle 15 base model, and that's going to be not quite this, but the carbine version. Colt ends up trying to make this whole family. The name doesn't really stick, and it just sort of goes back to being Colt AR15. What does the AR stand for? No. It's
a gun. It's that one. It's shaped like this, kind of has a knob.
And in fact, you see some period writing at the time. They're just like, it's AR15. It's just the name of the gun. Right? They're not worried about it then. This is sort of something that gets retconned where it's like, no, liberal, it means Armalite, not assault rifle. Despite the fact that Colt was like, what the fuck? It means automatic rifle. And of course, Colt's then selling the SP1 under this family of automatic rifles because, especially at this time, it's about this time, it's about a 50-50 split as far as people's understanding, where there's some articles that will use automatic to mean fully automatic, and there's some that mean automatic to mean automatic loading, which is the definition that it had prior to this. Especially if you go and shoot in shotgun circles or pistol shooting circles where both revolvers and autoloaders show up, the autoloaders will be called automatics. Like whenever you go and shoot shotguns, the Beretta gas-operated shotguns are automatics. What does the auto and automatic 5 stand for? The auto 5 shotgun? It's not full auto, it's automatic loading. That's why they call it that. The Colt government automatic pistol. The 1911 isn't full auto. It would be cool if it was.
Yeah, the Chinese did it sometimes.
So that's sort of that gist. Like the only way that you can be certain to be wrong is to say this is definitely what it stands for, because even the people who work there have no fucking clue. And it clearly wasn't written down. Right? And it also probably doesn't matter. Right. So it's something that you can argue about for fun, but you're probably wrong if you're sure it means one thing or the other.
Aggressive rifle.
Next up here, Colt only wrote AR-15. We just talked about this. Colt only wrote AR-15 on their M16s because of Armalite's contract. Yeah. It's not a fucking thing. Colt could have written SpongeBob SquarePants before SpongeBob was a thing, and Colt could have owned that too. No, there wasn't a contractual requirement for them to do it because they stopped doing it. It was just a thing Colt did because the gun was known as the AR-15. Right. Eventually, the automatic version becomes better known as the M16 because of the Vietnam notoriety, and the world's markets like that.
Yeah, and so everyone's like, look at the M16.
And so Colt starts marking these rifles just as M16. Yeah. And then they continue marking the semi-automatic guns as AR-15. And I think that's when people get their wires crossed. That they're like, that means they're different guns now. But if Colt makes 3 million guns that are AR-15s that are full auto, that the military calls an M16, and then Colt stops marking AR-15 on them, what does that make the gun? They took away the marking. Does that mean it's a completely different gun? I sure don't think so.
Check this out.
Yeah.
Look at this. Because these were forgings, right?
Yep.
And the semi-auto ones, we have these weird grind marks on the selector spots.
You took them off.
I think they probably said AR-15 because they were using these old shit forgings that they just had laying around. They probably applied the majority of the mark, which was very common. And it's very common even in World War II, where you do the marks that are going to stay the same across all the different models. And then you see they add different things onto it. I feel like that's probably why. They probably had a shit pot of these.
Yeah, so it's certainly a possibility that they had a bunch of AR-15 lowers sitting around still, and they're like, we're going to keep doing that for the semi ones, and then they just didn't stop.
Yeah, no, they're like, well, let's just keep using those. It's whatever. Right. Right? Because this is obviously something that had been repurposed, because look at, I'm sorry, that's just manifest. Yeah. And it makes sense from, a recycling standpoint, right? Yeah. If you're Colt. So that's probably why that happened, and it's hilarious because it's kind of like the name AR-15, where it just wasn't on purpose. They were just like, Colt's like, we didn't want to grind off that too. We just wanted to sell the gun.
I guess next on our list here is that the AR-15 was based on the semi-automatic AR-10. This one's confusing for two reasons. First off, no, it wasn't. Second off, there was actually a prototype semi-auto AR-10 that was made, because Armalite licensed manufacturers AR-10s to an armory in the Netherlands, which has a unpronounceable, made-up, funny people name.
And they did something
like
weird.
Artillery Inrichting or something. And they were curious if you could make a semi-auto only AR-10. They did it, and then they cut through the mag wells, including through the markings on mag wells. They essentially converted full auto guns to semi-auto.
Right.
As like a, could this work? Never sold any of them, just hung on to them. They're in a museum now. I think they made 20 of these guns, and they're all sitting in a museum now.
And the funny part is when all of this, when, the contract was done or whatever, with Netherlands or whatever.
The contract ended on pretty bad terms.
Well, and they said to Armalite, hey, do you want all of the data and shit that we found?
We figured out improvements to the gun. We got all that data. Would you like it?
And Armalite goes, go fuck yourself.
And Armalite's like, no.
Yeah, we don't want any of that shit. So yeah. A semi-automatic AR-10 happened, and Armalite said,
"No,
I don't want that."
Sorry, no.
Thing.
And that Armalite eventually does, like we said earlier, they consider their AR-10, and I think the only evidence of this is a picture where they talk about the AR-10 Sporter.
Right.
And there's not even really any evidence that this is for, I haven't seen this ad in any context. So this could just be something that some guy made and looked very convincing. And that's the trouble with this stuff, right? Is people
I want to make some shit up.
People like to make stuff up sometimes with this. So it seems plausible, at least, that Armalite considered, maybe we can make an AR-10 Sporter. They were probably very wise to not, because it would not have sold at all. Yep.
Because it would have been wildly expensive, especially with the way they wanted to make everything out of titanium.
Right. Our next section here. But it's a different gun. First up, the M16 is a totally different gun. It's got entirely different parts. This is a question.
Wait, hold on. Go ahead.
That's
Open that.
I see. No, of course I don't need to take that guy out. Anyway, of course, the M16 is an AR-15. The M16 is a designation for a particular configuration of select fire AR-15, right?
Right.
They're not entirely different parts, and in fact, parts-wise, they're swappable. If you have an AR-15 semi-auto and an M16 select fire, and you have them side by side, you can swap every part, including the lower, and the lower just goes over with its full auto parts. Swap uppers and lowers. Swap barrels.
Well, except for in this limited instance.
Right, bolt carrier groups. You do run into some weird things or like Colt's compliance stuff that gives you exceptions to this rule, but Colt's exception, like if you took an M16 and drilled it out to have a big old hole in it.
Well, I have one of the little eccentric bushings that they sell.
Bushings that you can put in this that lets it take on normal lowers. So it's just sort of a lack of understanding, right? Again, a category error.
Yeah, these holes are the same size. Sometimes they're slightly bigger, but the center lines of the holes are in the same positions. And so is this hole, and so is this hole. And the center line of this particular hole is slightly off, and it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Next little point here. This is a good one. The M16 is piston operated. The AR-15 is gas operated. I've seen this from three people. 3 people have brought this up. I think it's again from an AI generated article that tells you the differences. This one is.
Let's trade them back before I forget, because I will totally forget. And you just take a look there. The funny thing is, these probably started out as the same thing.
It's probably from the same exact manufacturing. They just make the modifications in there. Right, because it's always extra work that's done to Sporter
semi-auto
guns,
parts.
except for on the lowers, they'll have less cuts, usually.
Yeah, and there's exceptions there too.
Yeah.
But so yeah, you were saying the M16 is piston, and the AR15 is
gas operated.
gas operated. Yeah, no. So no, it's a steam piston actually.
Yes, a steam piston.
Or it's
instead of a
perhaps
gas piston.
diesel. That's just
No,
stupid.
this is idiotic. The nominally speaking, the M16 uses the regular AR-15 operating system, like most AR-15s do.
Right.
There are piston-operated AR-15s, but I think that sort of, from a taxonomical standpoint, I think that sits outside of the family of AR-15s because they've changed the operating system pretty substantially.
So here we've got the quintessential M16 AR-15. Here we've got something very interesting, and like a family history of them. These are Taiwanese piston-operated
Rifles.
The bolt carrier will not just hot swap because this is a hard key. It doesn't have a gas tube. You don't have sealing rings on the bolt itself.
It just has a piston that shits back and hits on the top of the carrier. You may be familiar with these systems from something like the HK416.
Right.
Surprise, surprise, HK is not very original, and they copied that from a gun that predates it substantially.
Yeah, so this is the Type 65. This is the Type 91. And it is a short stroke piston a la SVT-40 SKS and done completely independently in Taiwan.
To try and avoid the fact that Colt had the patent for the regular gas system.
So, which I think is very funny. So this is a evolution of this gun, which is certainly heavily based on this gun.
Right.
But you make the point that at this level, it became its own thing.
Right. It's based on an AR-15, and in fact goes on AR-15 lowers.
Right.
But the upper itself is pretty full of proprietary parts, and it works in a different way. And I think it's
And it also behaves in
right. And I think it's unfair to call it an AR-15. I think you need at least one more qualifier at that point.
No, that makes sense. I also really like these.
They are pretty neat.
But on the other hand, you've got something that you think is still an AR-15.
Right. You can get a little freaky with things. So this regular AR-15, regular piston operation.
Yeah.
It's not piston operation, but it's got AK mags it feeds from instead of regular mags, and it's also got funny handguards, funny stocks, and this is sort of an example of like you could make it look pretty different from how they used to look, but this would still be an AR-15.
Everything that's critical is still
right. Making it feed from a different magazine, I don't think puts it in a different taxonomical family. Having a different operating mechanism and the action itself has changed. I think you at least need one qualifier to say not AR-15, but AR-15 based, or AR-15 derived, or AR-15 inspired.
Right.
Pick your qualifier.
Yeah. That is a difficult one because I now kind of struggle with what I call a Type 91 aside from a Type 91.
Right.
Yeah, I'd say AR derived.
It really belongs in a family of AR-15 piston conversions,
Right.
Because there's the originator and the 91 and all of the 416 derivatives, and you have your Adams arms, and there's a company that makes a long. I think PWS has a long stroke. I guess it's not a short stroke conversion at that point anymore, but there's a lot of AR-15 based, physical piston systems.
Right. Yep. Interesting.
I guess moving on there. Semi-automatic AR-15s will explode if you shoot them quickly. I am not doubting that there are some semi-auto AR-15s on the commercial market that were made from substantially subpar parts that will have failures if you shoot them quickly, that an M16 or something that's made to the mil spec or to the prints wouldn't have that failure. However, if you have a semi-automatic trigger guy who does the trigger just as fast as a full auto, and nothing changes between the two guns, identical parts, it's just you pulling the trigger each time that fast or full auto, guns will perform the same. The way you pull the trigger.
The other funny thing is if you buy the barrel, the broken bolt carrier group and barrel extension from the same Turkish guy, and you put it
in a full
in
auto,
full
it'll
auto
also
one,
break.
yeah, it'll probably break actually a little faster.
Right. So that's just a silly one. I've heard it from a couple of people though, that like, oh, but if it's your PSA and it'll explode. That's not really true.
Yeah.
In fact, people have tested that.
Yeah.
Moving on, M16s cost $400. AR15s cost $2,000.
That's true.
Again, I think this must be an AI article thing. The best we could tell is there was an old Army report from the 90s that there's just like a PDF on floating on some .gov website,
Right.
where it's like they paid $400 for a couple thousand M16s.
Right.
That was their order of them. And that the guy was then pointing to the fact that he'd found a Daniel Defense AR that was on sale today for $2,000. And he's like, they're different guns. Sure, they are. These two specific examples of AR-15s, a Semiauto Daniel Defense DDM4 whatever, and an M16 that the Army bought a long time ago are different AR-15s. They're both still AR-15s.
Right.
People will then make, the final point is people make vague allusions to technical data packages, and they're different.
It's to the spec.
Sure, yeah, different manufacturers have different technical data packages. This shouldn't be a shock to anyone.
Right.
That's how manufacturing and trade secrets and IP in general work. The fact that they have them doesn't mean the M16 isn't an AR-15. In
Right.
fact, it's an interesting way of dodging the question. Like, oh yeah, well, the GM Hydromatic, they made M16s too. Yeah. and then people will say, well, the Hydromatic ones didn't say AR-15 on them. Okay.
Yeah, they also it fun because I love the markings on the Hydromatic one. You know why? Because GM was trying to make money, and so they put as little shit as they possibly could.
Well, and because
there's not even a logo on it.
Right, Colt owned the AR-15 trademark.
Yeah.
The reason that other companies were brought in to make the guns was sort of this, the similar agreement that companies make where the military's like, we'll let you be the supplier of this guns because you own it, but if we need more than you can supply, there's going to be some framework where you guys still get paid royalties by manufacturers that we can qualify and select that you'll share the data with.
Right.
And this infamously happened with the M4s and led to like M4 technical data being shared by everyone and their mother, because the Navy was like, you want the data package? You want the data package? You want to bid on this? Come bid on this. Come bid on this.
Yeah.
And Colt was like, dude, what the fuck are you doing?
Yeah. And that's why ARs are so cheap now.
Yeah. Part of it, actually.
Yeah. But I do love the GM because all of the other contractors for the M16 were like proud of them.
Yep.
Whereas General Motors is like, can I have some money? Like it's as simple as it could possibly
I guess
be.
there on the questions of markings, I don't think I made a specific lore point for it, but the Mattel rifle.
Didn't happen.
Mattel made they didn't make grips, they didn't make handguards, they didn't make stocks, they didn't make lowers. There's that famous picture of a guy who made an 80% lower to look like a Mattel. It's fucking great.
Yeah.
People think that's real. It's not
I think
real.
it's cool. It's not
There's
real.
a lot of
I wish it was real.
There's a lot of 80% retro AR cloning stuff that goes on that people think is real. And in fact, I found myself falling for it multiple times where I'm like, I finally found a picture of this rare Colt variant that somebody still has. It's a fucking fake. It's a repro. It's something an inspired build.
Yeah.
Our next category though, made up material mania. First off, the AR-15 is aluminum. The M16 is steel.
Yeah, that's true.
I've had two people drop this on me now. I have no idea where this comes from. Presumably it's just some delusion about the fact that like, well, the AR-15's light and the M16's heavy maybe.
Yes, you can't have a light gun like that made of soda can.
One guy I talked to who tried to explain somebody else's idiocy to me was like, well, if your experience with an M16 is an A2 or an A4 especially, and that's what you used in like some amount of military service or whatever, going to try and on a hide and seek hunt for our freedoms.
Right.
If that's your touch point for M16, it's kind of a dog. It's heavy. If then you come back to the civilian market and you buy something like a Colt Sporter or anything that's like under 6 pounds, 7 pounds, because those are like 8-9 pound rifles, pretty beefy, you'll be like, wow, this one's light. It must be made out of aluminum, and that other one was steel. When in reality, it just had a chonker of a barrel and an A4, a great big chunky rail on it.
Yeah, it just had more aluminum on it.
Right, lots more weight on the gun. It's not because of...
And a Harris bipod and a... Yeah.
The receivers are aluminum. I know I've seen companies like do titanium lowers. I know at one point in time Colt was experimenting with maybe trying to pull off a stamped lower. But the aluminum forgings on the AR-15 are pretty brilliant, and they paid for themselves so many times over by now that it's the reason AR-15s are cheap, despite the fact that forgings aren't necessarily something cheap to invest in. Here's a good one. Civilian AR-15s are poured metal from junk aluminum. The military AR-15s are forged. I think this comes from the fact that
Poured metal.
poured junk scrap aluminum.
Yeah,
actually.
scrap it.
I believe this one dates back to in the very early days of manufacturers that weren't Colt getting into the civilian AR-15 game. The companies that were manufacturing the forging at this time, there was like 2 or 3 of them, and these days there's like 7 or 8 or 9 or 10, depending on you, because they're aluminum forging companies that have AR-15 dies. They just don't always make them because it's an ebb and flow sort of a thing. That at this time there was only a couple of these companies, and Colt, Colt owned their production, right? Colt owned the dies. Colt was getting all the crap from them. Right. There wasn't much supply.
It can be like
for
can you use Colt's thing to
So what a lot of companies turn to is aluminum casting houses.
Right.
And they cast lowers out of some of the most dog shit aluminum possible.
Right.
Hesse casts some, Olympic Arms casts some, DPMS casts some. Some cast lowers were actually pretty respectable because they thickened them up where they needed to be. They actually used quality control and x-rayed them to make sure they weren't full of voids. Some manufacturers Hesse arms had lowers that were cracked. Like you couldn't do a push-up. Rifle push-up on your gun, it would crack the buffer tower off like it was made out of crappy printed plastic, which is kind of a shocking thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's where this delusion comes from. These days it's mostly forged or billet stuff. You can get into forged billet on ARs, which is better. Right. I don't really fucking care.
Yeah, it really doesn't matter.
It really
the brilliance of the design is that the receivers don't matter.
The safety factor on either one is like ha 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 ha.
It's like, sure, make it out of soybean oil. I don't care. Which we've done.
Right? Next up, the M16 has secret titanium firing pins.
Yeah, you can't take it from the military.
Right, that the military has secret titanium, and that's why the military tells you don't lose your firing pins, because if that titanium spec firing pin gets into civilian hands,
we're fucked.
Very dangerous, because it's an M16 fire. This is made up. I believe...
I've heard it more than once, though.
I've only heard one guy say it, and I bet the reason they said it was they had a drill instructor that told them some straight bullshit about, like, you'll get court-martialed and thrown out of the fucking army if you lose your firing pin. Like, never lose it because it's your life. And a civilian gets there, you go to jail whenever they shoot up a school with it. Just telling them some bullshit, and then you got your 70 IQ guy that's like, damn, that's true.
I have to go on twitter.com.
I'm not questioning that. There are titanium firing pins available for AR-15s. In fact, one of them is sold by the scam artist Stolen Valor, Great Big Liar guy who founded LWRC. He sells titanium firing pins these days. How the mighty have fallen. You can't even lie and make fake reviews from made-up veterans about your products in this country. That's fucked up.
Yeah. I don't even want to be here anymore.
I'm just going to make titanium firing pins that I import from Taiwan now.
Hell yeah.
The next, of course...
This one goes up to 11.
That one, of course, guys, isn't true. The M16 uses a secret steel in its barrel that's not legal for civilians to have because of technical data package. FN as a manufacturer, this may be a thing you heard in Armor's course, right? That FN has their own kind of special barrel steel, and when FN makes M4s or their M16s, they use their special machine gun steel barrel.
There's chocolate in it.
They put chocolate. That's the secret. Is they put chocolate in it. Yeah. They have their own proprietary barrel forging. Blah 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 blah. Certainly, manufacturers have their own trade secrets in some cases. In the case of FN, it's barrel making. Lots of manufacturers have trade secrets as far as their materials, like HK does for their bolts in the 416s.
Right.
Like, wow, we keep cracking these things. Let's come up with a new secret steel that will totally totally work. And
these crack different.
This isn't cope about our guns just being awful. No, the secret squirrel steel isn't. It's not a
thing. Yeah,
it's you can use the M16 secret steel barrels in AR-15s actually.
Yeah. And in fact, guess what? They sell them.
Yeah, they sell them actually.
You can just buy them.
FN's just straight up sells the secret squirrel. In fact, PSA will put FN secret squirrel barrels in their El Cheapos.
Yeah, and it doesn't even cost that much more.
Right.
Yeah, they'll do it in their cheapo one. It just depends on like if FN was poured that day.
Right.
He's like, you want an extra 10,000 barrels? They're made of chocolate steel.
Our last one in the made-up material mania, we touched on it earlier, but people think that the company's name is ArmorLite, and they think that's because the material the guns were made out of was called ArmorLite.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's spelled Light, like light armor.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
I have no idea where this delusion comes from. Maybe it's AI generated. Maybe it's just like maybe they heard like 50% of a conversation of somebody saying, "Hey, liberal, it stands for Armalite," and they're like, "Wow, ArmorLite."
That's the gun. That's how the gun is light like that.
It's because of the ArmorLite. No, it's not made out of ArmorLite, but that would actually be kind of baller.
Yeah, I wish that one was true.
If they had patented aluminum forgings and then trademarked it as a
ArmorLite,
that'd be kind of good.
We're the only ones who use ArmorLite registered trade.
Finally, our last category is the never ever category. This is something that Paul Harrell, peace be upon him, if he hasn't made it to the time this video gets out, that would be unfortunate. But he has a great video where a series actually where he talks about spotting a fake expert, where a fake expert in the gun world will constantly make statements about never happened, ever happened, wouldn't happen, never did, didn't think about, like very absolute statements about things that it's like, oh buddy, you could do an Othias like week-long research splurge about this and come out with less answers than you went in with. Right. Like you were like, oh my god, all the things I thought were true were actually probably not. Right. So there's a lot of things that people fall into the trap of never evering about AR-15s. The big one, right? The huge one. No military has ever used a semi-automatic AR-15. Right. Whenever the Air Force adopted the AR-15, in their part number armor list, they talk about a selector that limits the gun to semi-auto only for use in nighttime operations. From the very
That's not a real military.
From the very, very beginning, before a semi-automatic AR-15 existed, there was a semi-automatic AR-15 configuration that the Air Force might have
But that's
used.
Air Force. It's not
there
real.
isn't a lot of documentation about that. No clue if it actually ever got issued, but the thought was there at least. It only gets worse for the never-everers. You fast forward a little bit. The Philippine military has used semi-automatic AR-15s in a DMR role for some time. They had so much success killing ISIS fighters in an island near the Philippines. It's a fucking Wild West out there. They were putting artillery pieces in cities and buildings. It's a very interesting little fight that they had. They squashed them pretty good, though. And they attributed a lot of their combat success to the fact that they were issuing like one DMR semi-auto AR-15 for every M4, their equivalent of the M4. And they were killing a lot of people because they had scoped rifles going up against guys who were probably not very well equipped. So, very combat effective, right? And that they call that the MSSR. You can do research on it. The guy who designed it has a Facebook where he like posts pictures of some of the developmental guns. It's kind of an interesting thing. And that's the Marine Scout Sniper Rifle, I believe they call it. In
modern super sporting rifle.
Most of them are still built on third pin lowers. But especially the most recent ones, they have Geisley commercial triggers they import and put in them. Which is just kind of funny. Two-stage semi-auto triggers. Fast forwarding a little bit more, you run into the U.S. military issuing in combat roles semi-automatic AR-15s. In Afghanistan, both the Marines and Army had experimental programs looking at 5.56 DMRs. The Marines version, I believe, was the SAMR. The Army's version was the SDMR. Some of them I've talked with some Marines who use because there's only 100 of the Marines that got these guns, and I've talked with 2 who had them, which is kind of cool. I just bumped into them both on Twitter. One of them had a gun that had a full auto fire control group in it, not with the auto steer in the gun. The other guy had the full auto fire control group in the gun with a 2-position selector. Marines.
Yeah, they just like
they just had some dog shit their armors put together. Like, fuck it, DMR.
Got a new upper for this one.
The Army's DMRs fared a little bit better. Most of those had CAC 2-stage triggers, and then the CAC match grade triggers they're making. This is Knights Armor Corporation. 2-stage nice triggers in them. They still had third pin lowers. They took the pinholes out of them. I've talked with one guy who was part of a group that had SDMRs in it. Said didn't have third pins in them. I found pictures of SDMRs where the resolution is high enough. It's like there's no pin in that hole. So,
like the hole is empty, or
the hole is empty.
Okay.
They just took the pin in the auto steer. All those parts came out of the gun, leaving them with a semi-automatic fire control group, semi-automatic trigger, with a little bit of a better trigger pull. Right. They put Krieger barrels on them. At that point, I think some of them may have even experimented with free floating. with the regular triangle handguards, like they were just copying some of the national match stuff that was going on back in these states, which is kind of funny. Like Krieger barrel, fake free float tube. They made in the national match AR semi-auto in combat, and these guns were very well received. So no, certainly, right, semi-automatic AR-15s did rather well in that particular instance. And fast forward even further, the war in Ukraine. There's videos of Ukrainian special forces with their tricked out, decked out AR-15s, running them on semi-auto clearing trenches. I have to, and there's better pictures of the guns being used, and there's no shortage of pictures of semi-auto AR-15s, just no pinholes going on whatsoever. Pictures of the reserve troops training with Anderson poverty ponies that got donated over there. Certainly no shortage of semi-auto AR-15 action going on in Ukraine. And it's interesting that the special operations fighters would have access to AKs, but it's difficult to put night vision and integrate AKs with your nods that they doubtlessly have. Being the sort of top tier fighters, they're willing to take semi-auto ARs over select fire AKs because putting an optic and night vision on it is a much better force multiplier than select fire. And I think anybody who's shot select fire much will go, that's about the way that goes.
Definitely true.
If you're going out and shooting people, it's better to have accurate aim fire on semi-auto, especially at nighttime.
Right. When
the guys you're fighting have select fire AKs, and missing really fast at night may be fun, but not when you're dead. Additionally, moving on in our never ever category, we've got the uppers and lowers won't fit together. People seem to be confused about the fact that Colt's Sporter 1, Sporter 2, and then the A2 Sporters won't fit. They had a different size and slightly different location for the front takedown pin.
Yeah, which was for a limited period of time, and these guns are fairly rare.
Right, and specific only to the Colt guns, and they didn't make a ton of them. And whenever other manufacturers came onto the scene, they didn't do that. They didn't do that.
And also, by the way, new Colt marks them M16 and marks them all the shit, and also doesn't do this.
Right.
Whereas these Colts, like, this isn't the most rare one, but it's kind of an expensive collector's item at this point. And
there are exceptions to the rule, but the rule is the receiver sets are based on each other.
Right.
That whenever you really get down into the nitty gritty, the Colt Sporters were based on the 602, 604, since those were more or less the same thing at that moment of inception. The AR-15 semi-automatics that we have today are based on the M16A2.
Right.
Because they have, for the most part, they have the reinforcing hubs. Colt was sort of the one weird company that didn't go along with that very well.
And I am now fully convinced it was because they just had a shit ton of these.
Shit.
And even look at your derivative ones.
Yep.
That's a distinctly M16A2 feature.
Yep. Our final tidbit of AR-15 lore in this great big video that hopefully people have managed to sit through. If you use a semi-automatic in war, you will die.
That's true.
There is a chance
you will die.
There is a chance this will happen.
You will also die if you use a fully automatic in war.
Right, because eventually you die anyway.
Yeah.
No, the military uses and issues semi-automatics and has for a long time. The fabled Garand was a semi-automatic used in war.
All people who use Garands died.
Most of those guys have now died. Perhaps there is some truth to this. The military today issues the SR-25 semi-automatic, M110. All the different branches call it something different.
They will all die.
Semi-auto rifles, anyway. Handguns they issue are semi-automatic. They issue semi-automatic shotguns. Even they've issued semi-automatic AR-15s. Those guys were alive. I talked to them. They seem to have a good time shooting terrorists with them. So I'm not entirely convinced that if you use a semi-automatic in war, you will die. Additionally,
as a result of your use of it.
Additionally, the more combat veterans that saw action in the whole desert sandbox thing you talk to, you'll run into a bunch of them that have the same sort of story where it's like, I was on combat patrols, active duty for years. I can count the number of times I did something besides semi-auto with one hand. And it was because we were back on base and we had checked out a bunch of ammo for the day and it's hard to check it back in.
Right.
And we just burned through magazines as quickly as we could. I've talked with guys who were special forces that had burst M4s that took burst out and put semi-automatic fire control groups they bought from home because the burst mechanism gives you an inconsistent trigger pull, and these guys were interested in killing people. They don't want inconsistent trigger pulls. They'd rather just have a good semi-automatic. There's no shortage of stories of guys who's like, we use semi-automatic to get business done.
Right.
The amount of full auto fire you use is very limited. There's guys I've talked to that were not, they weren't sort of trained for frontline combat roles, who said they didn't boot camp all their rifle training, never used it. They were not instructed on it, no idea how to use it. They were told, don't use that. If you have to shoot your gun, you put it on semi-automatic, you aim shots. The military's doctrinal use of select fire on AR-15s is extremely limited. And it seems that the instruction, the doctrine, the cohesive instructions I've got from the guys who are trained with these things, who have done these sorts of things, is if your machine gunner goes down, his gun's jammed, he gets hit, he's busy, wants to go jerk one out in the porta potty, whatever happens, then is a time when maybe select fire will be useful on your individual rifles. Other than that, maybe if you're doing some like M16A4s in Fallujah and you're clearing these tiny little mud huts with a full-length rifle, maybe because you just got to get it around the corner, you're not going to be able to aim it because the doorways are too narrow. Maybe there's some use for it then, but even then, we've seen Ukrainians clear trenches that tight on semi-auto only against a bunch of Russian conscripts that have AKs who are just there for fodder, which is kind of sickening to watch in many ways, but then fascinating to watch that semi-auto in war didn't die. And that sort of wraps up our never-evers from a standpoint of there's plethora of evidence of military doctrinal use, even in the United States, is semi-auto is the one you use to kill people.
No.
You gotta put it on fully because the military and M16 more deadly.
It's a weapon to war. You gotta hose them down.
Weapon war.
Carl on duty.
Carl duty.
Yeah. Do.
M16 3 burst.
Three bursts. It's just like Counter-Strike because that way you just put it on them and
dig it down.
Yeah. And
two in the chest, one head.
Yeah, that's the Mozambique.
Anyway, super long
Mozambique A2 drill.
I hope we've busted through enough AR-15 lore. If you guys like this sort of video where we just sort of break down insane Fudd lore, I guess let us know because we've got other ideas. We've got other well springs of source of this sort of garbage that we can sort of interrogate and get into.
Yeah.
And that sort of wraps up what I wanted to say. There's your AR-15 comprehensive breakdown video of the AR-15 lore that I've encountered since I started keeping track about 2 years ago.
Thanks for watching.
Goodbye.